Thank you for joining us today. The consortium is the Consortium of Gender, Sexuality, Race, and Public Culture here at USC. Is delighted to welcome Professor Jamilla Musser to USC as our scholar in residence for the week. So Professor Musser is giving a talk today, and then on Thursday there's a graduate seminar, which maybe some of you will be attending, where Professor Musser will also be talking about sensation as method. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce her. So Jamilla Musser is a professor of English and Africana Studies at the CUNY Graduate Center. She writes and researches at the intersections of race, sexuality, and aesthetics. In addition to writing art reviews for the Brooklyn Rail, she has published widely in queer studies, Black feminism, psychoanalysis, and critical theory. She is the author of Sensational Flesh, Race, Power, and Masochism, NYU Press 2014, Sensual Excess, Queer Femininity and Brown Jouissance, NYU Press 2018, and Between Shadows and Noise, Sensation, Situatedness, and the Undisciplined from Duke University Press this year, 2024. And the other collaborative project that I would like to talk about is that Professor Musser has co-edited the collection Keywords for Gender and Sexuality Studies through NYU Press in 2021 and has co-hosted an accompanying podcast called Feminist Keywords, which is sponsored by the consortium, and you can find it on the USC Consortium website, and please assign it to your students or listen to it. I've been having my students listen, and it's been a really great way for them to hear some of these key terms in conversation. So with that, I give you Professor Musser.
So thank you so much, Atia. Thank you, Sam, Helen, for all of your work bringing me here and generously hosting me. I also want to thank Karen Tongson, who unfortunately is not able to be here, for the generous invitation. Karen sort of pops into my life at various very well-timed moments, and this particular moment is when I need a break. So this is my trip to California and LA to chill out and be with you guys. So the talk that I'm going to give today is part of the first chapter of Between Shadows and Noise. In some ways it's very different from the rest of the book, but I think we'll have a nice conversation about it. So it's about Jordan Peele's film Us, which is also very appropriate given that this is Halloween week. So if you have not seen it, well, if you haven't seen it, there are a lot of spoilers for the film. But if you haven't seen it because you're scared, maybe you'll feel more emboldened because you know what happens. All right, so enticed by the promise of a new Jordan Peele film starring Lupita Nyong'o, I made my way to the theater for an early evening screening. Unlike Get Out, whose plot twist provided some of the film's shock, the trailers for Us foreground the film's conceit. A family comes home from a day at the beach to find murderous doubles in their home. While the film complicates this reveal, the sense of dread it activates comes not from suspense, but from the uncanny. And that's going to be the sensation that I'm unpacking for you today. So although I'm borrowing this term from Freud, who describes it as a sensation of the unheimlich or unhomely, in this talk I'm going to elaborate on what this idea of the unhomely means for thinking about Black femininity, which offers a context that complicates ideas of domesticity, property, and interiority. So what I want to tell you is that I see the uncanny as operating in the film as a signal of the type of threat that Black femininity activates in the broader US imaginary. So that's the synopsis of the talk. So even before the doppelgangers are introduced, the film, especially upon repeat viewing, percolates with the sense that something is amiss. Nyong'o snaps off beat, wide-eyed and nervous. She surveys her surroundings. A high-angle shot of the family at the beach emphasizes their elongated shadows. Teenage twins speak in tandem. The clock reads 11:11. The coincidences add up, and the anxiety that Nyong'o registers transmits from actor to audience, even though we all know what's coming. Underlying the unease, anxiety, and dread is the creeping sense that what we thought we knew cannot be trusted. In this case, the uncanny highlights the threat that Black women and girls present. People might not be who you think, and much lurks beneath the surface. So this is the poster. When we first meet Red, Abraham, Umbre, and Pluto, they are shrouded in shadow. This is the first time that the anxious feeling is personified in the present. Jason spots the group first and offers a warning. There's a family in our driveway. Behold. The family inside, Adelaide, Gabe, Zora, and Jason, become nervous. Gabe, the father, ventures outside to offer the group what turns out to be an ineffective threat. Now I thought I already done told y'all to get off my property. What follows are sequences of captivity, chase, and death in which each of the central actors, Lupita Nyong'o, Winston Duke, Shahidi Wright Joseph, and Evan Alex, run away from distorted versions of themselves. The film eventually explains these doubles, two bodies sharing and connected by a soul, but it may be easier to understand them in the language that Red uses when she confronts Adelaide and her family. Once upon a time, there was a girl. The girl had a shadow, and they were connected, tethered. In this life, in and of shadows, food is raw and toys cut. While Adelaide, above ground, falls in love and has two beloved children, Red is forcibly joined with Abraham in a union that produces two monstrous children and includes a self-performed cesarean. Red's narration lays bare the specific horrors that attend life without bodily autonomy in its resonance with plantation slavery's severing of kinship through forced reproduction and rape. In other words, Red, Abraham, Umbre, and Pluto appear to index the return of a repressed past, activating a notion of the uncanny that Freud describes as, quote, nothing new or foreign, but something familiar and old, established in the mind that has been estranged only by the process of repression, something which ought to have been kept concealed, but which has nonetheless come to light. So here the casting of Nyong'o, who won an Oscar for her role as Patsy in Steve McQueen's 12 Years a Slave, offers its own anchor into this interpretation. This historical echo is especially evident in the primary lack that Red, the only double with a specific complaint, vocalizes, which is that things happen to her without her choosing them. She does not consent. This inability, explained by the tether in the film, registers as racially significant, such that Red's dilemma resonates with the historical understanding of the constrained agency of Black women and girls. So take, for example, Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of the Slave Girl, the 1861 autobiography that describes Jacobs's attempts to navigate the sexually predative man who enslaved her, his vindictive wife, and a white neighbor with whom she engages in a sexual relationship in a narrative of confinement and escape. In Scenes of Subjection, Saidiya Hartman uses Jacobs's chosen and controversial seduction of her neighbor to argue that conditions of enslavement freight both desire and consent in ways that illustrate the need for an alternate understanding of what constitutes agency. As Hartman argues, the nexus of desire, consent, and coercion that situates the discussions of the slave girl sexuality perhaps entails in consideration that attends to the agency of the dominated in terms other than those we have previously considered. For if not a conspiracy of power, seduction in this instance enables opportunities for disruption and offers a glimpse of possibility in the context of peril. So what Hartman points toward is a reading of actions and wants that may be constrained, but that are still thoughtful, something that she describes as deliberate calculation that reckons with the possibilities of agency that exist under conditions of duress, coercion, dispossession, manipulation, and constraint. And so deliberate is indeed the best word that describes Red's behavior in Us. As the narrative unfolds, it becomes clear that she is the mastermind behind the uprising, coordinating the matching jumpsuits, leather glove, and strategy for untethering. Her movements are precise and calculated, and her plan, a very literal cutting of the cord, makes evident the lengths to which the desire for bodily autonomy persists even in conditions of deep deprivation. This version of Us as Uncanny is an overt commentary on the ways that history overburdens possibility, allowing us to consider the ways that the film's two bodies tethered by a soul illuminates the racialized shadow structures that underlie agency, desire, and liberal subjectivity. So for these reasons, historian Emily Owens draws a line of continuity between the impossibility of consent under conditions of enslavement and the difficulty contemporary Black women find in seeking justice in cases of sexual violence, arguing that this negation of sexual agency continues to mark the experience of Black women. And so this is Owens. The history of consent's ability to protect only certain women is directly tied to those whose consent historically mattered, whose consent was imagined as legible, who could be considered a victim of gender-based violence, and that history certainly informs which women consent will or won't protect in the present. So Owens further suggests that Black women will never really be able to consent, given the ways that this history of sexual exploitation shapes the legibility of Black women's communication, not only to immediate parties, but also to external assessors, such as jurors. The problem of consent then reveals the way that the ability to claim desire is inextricably linked to recognition. So indeed, Red's failure to attain recognition is one of the consistent threads of the film. While the other doubles pursue more direct forms of disposing of their above-ground counterparts, Red's elaborate game of chase not only defers the possibility of her freedom in favor of exposition. So the film is kind of amazing, because like all of these other moments when the other doubles emerge, they immediately kill these people, except Red always wants to have a conversation, which I think is fascinating. It gives us a lot to think about. So this suggests that the untethering, at least for Red, might also have a psychological component. I see these extended expositions as emphasizing Red's need for Adelaide to acknowledge her as a subject, a process akin to the relation between desire and recognition that Hegel postulated with the master-slave dialectic, which is partially why the scissors are so useless. This is to say that Adelaide's refusal to recognize Red as her own subject, encapsulated by Red's voiced outrage that Adelaide could not imagine that they could both live above ground and share resources. And this is a spoiler. This is kind of like what happens at the end when she's like, "Why did you leave me? Why did you leave me down there as a child?" And share resources instead of having one of them consigned to shadow living. So that's the underside to Red's complaint about being unable to act. So notably, there's a fierceness to Adelaide's attempts to claim desire, both as a means of individuation and as a drive towards normalization. Even before the elaborate chase sequences, Adelaide clings to property, self, family, and house, such that we can register the anxiety she voices to Gabe early in the film about a black cloud hanging over me, is that her life will disappear in the absence of these things. By the end of the film, however, we are given to understand that the retribution Adelaide fears has to do with the fact that she exchanged places with girl Adelaide, confining her to a subterranean life, effectively, at least through the lens of property, stealing that which had been hers. This is to say that Us also understands desire and possession to be inextricably linked, something that we can also feel when we read the film through the horror subgenre of home invasion, a trope which is triggered by Gabe's injunction to get off my property. Since this genre activates the fear of a border being breached alongside a submerged acknowledgement that securitization is a futile endeavor, the terror of unboundedness hovers alongside the uncanny, providing an alternate valence to Freud's description of the term as unhomely. This version of the sensed uncanny produces something more akin to vertigo, the dizzying sensation of being unmoored, mobilized here by the impossibility of home. We can even put this unhomeliness in a broader racial socioeconomic perspective. The Wilsons are, as Cherie Marie Harrison reminds us, the Black petite bourgeoisie, who have job security and vacations, but are still less well off than their white counterparts. And we see this with there's a constant trope around like, your boat is bigger than my boat, and your house is bad. Sometimes it's just like, anyway, this is what happens when you talk about pop culture. Sometimes it feels ridiculous in moments. So Harrison locates this racialized class stratification in the differential effects of the United States' falling GDP between 1984 and 1990, a time period to which the film makes several references. This precarity underlies the Wilsons' relationship to home and property, showing how property is an important aspect of liberalism's ascendancy to whiteness, even as the shadow of Black dispossession overwhelms. This precarious relationship is also evident in the bankrupting of cities in the United States, and as Tiffany Lithobo King argues, ongoing struggles against gentrification and displacement by disasters like Hurricane Katrina, which continue to reveal the tenuous relationship that Blacks have to land tenure. These literal forms of being unhomed suggest, as Harrison argues, that Red and her family be understood through the lens of Frantz Fanon's lumpen proletariat, or landless peasants, who circle tirelessly around different towns, hoping that one day or another they will be allowed inside, and the promise of mass uprising by an underclass. Through this lens, the exploitation of an underclass and the concept of property are the shadow sides of what it is to be an American, as Red names herself and her family. So like one of the famous trailers for the film was like, "Who are you?" And Red smiles and says, "We're Americans." which is just perfect. So these relations of race and property also allow us to register the ways that having Black protagonists upend the home invasion genre itself by focusing on what happens when home itself is unstable, such that the parameters of invasion are endlessly mutable, thus illuminating the ways that us functions as Peele's own particular deconstruction of that genre from the inside out. So thinking further with Peele's disruption of genre, Us also makes palpable the uncanniness that undergirds Black women's relationships to the domestic. So it's not just the shadow of dispossession that renders the home unstable, but also that Black women's fraught relationship to the domestic operates as a threat from inside. While the horror genre makes abundant use of the precarity of the domestic, precisely because the home often acts as a metonym for safety and belonging, Us brings our attention toward the threat that Black women present when they are, in fact, ensconced in domestic family life. Interestingly, Us does not use these complex relationships to critique domesticity. Instead, the film provides a meditation on the multiple forms of anxiety that Black women can incite. And here, well, I'll get into it, but both of these women are threatening, is part of my argument. So in this production of Black women as threat, I align Us with other films like Ma, starring Octavia Spencer, in which Black women's maternal affects terrorize others. However, despite Adelaide and Red's status as mothers, the aura of threat comes from how Black women use the privacy afforded by domesticity to sort of upend things. So in this way, kind of both women in their own ways become leaders of movements for freedom. So in Adelaide and Red's cultivation of family and resistance, we find an echo with Angela Davis's 1971 essay, Reflections on the Black Women's Role in a Community of Slaves, where she argues for the importance of living quarters as offering respite from work and surveillance. And this is Davis. We can assume that in a very real material sense, it was only in domestic life, away from the eyes and whip of the overseer, that the slaves could attempt to assert the modicum of freedom they still retained. While Davis is forthright about the labor of this extra burden for Black women, she is quick to assert its centrality to practices of resistance, sociality, and survivance. She writes, even as she was suffering under her unique oppression as female, she was thrust by the force of circumstance into the center of the slave community. She was therefore essential to the survival of the community. Not all people have survived enslavement, hence her survival-oriented activities were themselves a form of resistance. So in the film's foregrounding of Adelaide and Red's different creative practices of survival, we can read the two women as occupying two sides of the same coin. And this is why I like this poster. But in this portrait of inversion, and here I think we can consider Red to be Adelaide's negative, which I've heard people sort of argue that this is kind of like why she's named Red, because negatives are red as opposed to black and white. They both remain sutured to the sense of Black women as threat. So initially the film focuses on the danger posed by Red and her murderous underground army. The viewer, infected by Adelaide's anxiety, spends much of the film worrying about Red's plans for uprising, strategies that we might read in a continuation of other resonances as proxies for the unanticipated, at least by slavers, resistance produced by the enslaved. Notably, however, Davis's reflections emphasizes the ways that rape and sexual coercion were employed against enslaved Black women. These violences against body and spirit, serving as disincentive or punishment for resistance, while simultaneously activating cleavages in the fabric of Black belonging, motivating distrust from Black men as to Black women's perceived relationship to power. Indeed, Red's narrative of forced coupledom with Abraham, although at the behest of tether rather than slaver, produces a glimpse at the aftermath of such disciplining. There's no real tenderness between them. That Red does not survive then might be Peele's commentary on these tactics and the perceived severity of the threat that Black women incite. Of course, by the time Red is killed, we understand that Adelaide is the more dangerous figure and her menace more covert. Adelaide is passing. In this way, Us invites us to consider the moment the Heimlich becomes the unheimlich, a transition that underscores the representational uncertainty of the uncanny and what it says about the ontological nature of the threat posed by Black women. So Peele, we're just gonna stay there. So Peele signals the movement between the Heimlich and unheimlich by lingering a bit too long on girl Adelaide's smiles in the flashbacks, giving them time to curdle, this extra beat adding as a visual and effective sign of difference. The film teases the porosity of the border between Red and Adelaide several times, but it is only in the last few minutes that we see the flashback of girl Adelaide being dragged through the tunnels and chained to the bed that it all falls into place. Suddenly, we are given a way to reread Adelaide and Red's practices of survival and resistance. Both are honed by childhoods underground, which are notably marked by the quality of overdetermination. In addition to upending what viewers may have thought they understood, this series of nested smiles, their own masks, invites us to think about the link between privacy passing and the imposter. And sort of go here. As a trope in cinema and elsewhere, the imposter's facility with belonging incites paranoia. Danger or difference are not only unrecognized, but they lurk within interior, private contours. Of course, Adelaide is not the only imposter in Us. One of the reveals that complicates reading the film through the lens of the return of the racialized repressed is the presence of other doubles. Before this point, viewers might have been able to imagine that Red, Abraham, Umbre, and Pluto are alone, although the emergency services that never arrive signal broader disturbance. But eventually we meet the Tyler family's doppelgangers who murder the family just before Adelaide, Gabe, Zora, and Jason arrive at their home. That this family, unlike the Wilsons, is taken totally unaware offers insight into Adelaide's difference. If Red surfaces the overdetermined imago of dispossessed, non-agential Black woman, Adelaide appears as a rare figure in popular culture, a normal, and not incidentally vacationing, member of the Black bourgeoisie, loving, playful wife to Gabe, and protective, nurturing mother to Zora and Jason. Conjoining these images through the tether reveals their mutual imbrication, their friction, and just how much both projections are undergirded by how much we do not know about these women. Everything is hidden beneath their visage. This is privacy in its uncanny mode, produced as ominous because of racialization. Thus, the film's real reveal is that the distance between these two positions is not very far at all. So from the perspective of those who are attempting to defend access to privilege, passing narratives are often framed as morality tales, written as warning signs to those who might pass to attempts to endow categories with an ontological certainty that their performativity undercuts. This perspective presumes the performativity of identity and uses it to illustrate the hypocrisy of differential value based on perception. Whether circulating as morality tale or critique, however, the aura of uncanny suffuses these narratives, underscoring the threat posed by the passer, either as alien or critic. The alien attempts to contain its unfamiliarity, fearing exposure, while the critic wishes to expose the ruse underlying the familiarity of the system. In this regard, the uncanny feeling that Adelaide activates as a passing figure registers multiply. There are several moments, her propensity towards excessive use of force, her grunting, and her loss of language, where she moves from the familiar to the unfamiliar. Likewise, in the vein of social critique, her ability to infiltrate the upwardly mobile Black middle class invites anxiety about the artifice of its borders and its value more generally. However, Us stops short of critique. And here I think we can have a broader conversation about like Peele as an artist and sort of like what his projects may be. Adelaide is never punished for her transgression, nor does she divest from the systems in which she is embedded. Unlike Red, who is fighting to liberate those below ground, Adelaide prefers escaping the US in favor of Mexico, rather than revolution. So Adelaide's full integration, including her suggestion to settle in another country, in fact, suggests a further uncanny aspect of the Black domestic, one with echoes of what Erica Edwards describes as, quote, imperial grammars of Blackness, and what Joy James defines as the captive maternal. For James, the captive maternal are those who are most vulnerable to violence, war, poverty, police, and captivity, whose very existence enables the possessive empire that claims and dispossesses them. James, however, is less invested in victimization and more interested in the harnessing of their productivity and consumption for projects of governance, prisons, police, and the military. So what is useful about James's captive maternal is the way it uncovers the co-optation of the possibilities of the domestic that Davis outlines, right? So we sort of start with like, oh, there's possibility in this privacy, and then James's argument is like, but empire can take that and use it for other purposes. Edwards's Imperial Grammars of Blackness also captures this uncanny twist on the Black domestic, but embeds it within a specific post-World War II framework. The historical arc that Edwards traces brings together the verbal and visual language of Black achievement, Black suffering, and Black resistance that the US has used to justify invasion, occupation, perpetual detainment, and other military carceral modalities of counterterrorism. So like James, Edwards is interested in the co-optation of the labor of the dispossessed. Her focus, however, is on the specific horizons of possibility mobilized by the idea of Black inclusion, especially when used to mark others as unassimilable subjects or targets of war. In this complex imperial project, Black women especially signify multiply, either as radical threats, and we could sort of argue, that's why I have this red army, right? So in some ways, red actually signifies the possibility of this, like, I don't want to say communist, but communalist uprising, or as model patriots, right? Which we have the suggestion that we settle in Mexico. This form of imperial agency, Edwards argues, serves as a proxy for the creativity needed to perform preparedness, which indexes Black female empowerment's entanglement with the military-industrial complex and its structural fictions of safety, bourgeois notions of Black women's roles in reproducing viable Black families, and the development of a US visual culture in which Blackness could simultaneously be valued as an aesthetic object and disarticulated from both US citizenship and radical challenges to the violence that secures it. So Edwards' vast framework of complicity and ambivalence is important to casting a critical eye toward the relationship between the fostering of Black domesticity and its redeployment in the service of imperialism. Both Edwards and James give us another way to read Adelaide's assimilation, that which marks her as a member of the petite bourgeoisie, vacation home, boat, intact family, signify incorporation, however messy, into the social body of the United States via consumption. That which has been rendered unassimilable, so Red and her collectivist impulses has been expelled. The labor of the Black domestic has been co-opted and rendered uncanny, terrorizing the marginalized rather than acting in solidarity. Drawing on Edwards further, we might ask what it means that Peele unleashes this narrative now. There's no catharsis, right? We cannot read Adelaide as a triumphant racial icon, which is the point, but it might also explain the confused box office response to the film. In contrast to the triumphant legibility of Get Out, Peele has produced a narrative that illuminates ambivalence and Black complicity with empire, replete with Mexican expansion. And he has couched it, I know, it's amazing, right? And he has couched it within a narrative of Black achievement and inclusion. The character's race is not discussed or remarkable within the film. This perhaps is an uncanny moment of coincidence with contemporary racial and class politics in the United States. So that's my critique of Peele. But I think the film also is doing something else. So in Us, the uncanny surfaces overlapping and contradictory shadow discourses that surround Black women, a tethering to histories of enslavement and being a domestic threat. But the film also leaves us with her fundamental illegibility as a subject position. For me, as a viewer, this inscrutability coalesces into the figure of the Black girl, whose presence operates as a noisy excess in the film. Throughout the film, her appearances convolute linear temporality, anchoring the present narrative into a past moment, only to render both more opaque. The film begins with the reflection of young Adelaide Addy, played by Madison Curry, in a flickering television before moving to the Santa Cruz boardwalk. There we see her wander away from her family into Vision Quest, the attraction containing a hall of mirrors where Addy encounters not quite her reflection. The first time we are presented with this moment, the camera shoots from behind to show two pairs of shoulders and pigtails before cutting to Addy's wide-eyed, anyway. Well, you can look on the screens to the side if you want a better visual of what's happening, to Addy's wide-eyed reaction. The second time, adult Adelaide recounts the event to her husband, Gabe, and we see that instead of a reflection, Addy and the other girl turn to face each other. The third time is a brief flash to Addy's face when the adult Adelaide enters the Hall of Mirrors, now named Merlin's Woods. The fourth time we see them look at each other face to face, we are privy to the girl in the mirror's perspective, allowing us to see the fear in Addy's eyes as she registers that the girl in the mirror is not her reflection. And finally, we return to the event in the aftermath of Adelaide and Red's showdown. We observe the encounter from a neutral perspective in its entirety. The girl from the mirror subdues Addy, drags her underground, and then chains her to a bed. Within these repetitions with difference, there is much to consider. Narratively, these scenes inform the feelings expressed by the characters in the present, by giving insight into Adelaide's anxiety, Red's desire for revenge, and Adelaide's subterfuge by offering a prelude to the actions we are following. In addition to bolstering the scene's narrative and effective significance, the effect of returning to this moment, to this girl, reveals something about the uncanniness that I'm describing as noisy excess of the Black girl. Each time we return to Addie, she grows less and less familiar to us, in a way that activate a riot of significations, movements, and attachments to the Black girl. So while Black boys receive much concerned attention, especially vis-a-vis aggressive policing, surveillance, and premature death, Black girls do not, remaining, as Amy Meredith Cox argues, illegible. So some of this illegibility has to do with the more general estrangement that Blackness produces from conventional categories of childhood. In the context of enslavement, perhaps exemplified again in Jacobs's incidents of the life of the slave girl, sexual violence, labor, and one could argue shrewd interpersonal negotiation contrast with the imaginary of girlhood as a time of innocence and play. However, this merger between the categories of youth and adulthood persists, often bringing categories together. For example, in her analysis of the 19th century literary figurations of Black girls, Nazira Wright argues that they were seen as allegorical figures for Black struggles for progress and liberation. In this framing, it is their status as not yet subjects, one suspended on a threshold before citizenship and before womanhood, that undergirds this representational possibility, right? So they're sort of like not quite there. They're always could be something else. Contemporary discourses on Black girls also reference this theoretical space betwixt and between, positioning Black girls between can-do or at risk, or as Cox argues, defined primarily by their status as both female and adults in the making. We can even see the ways that this malleability underlies the trajectories that Erica Edwards outlines in her discussion of the imperial grammars of Blackness. Black girl will either persist in her disruption of the system or be disciplined into it. It is this amorphous quality, its own version of fungibility, that makes the Black girl so compelling in us. Each time we return to the mirror, we change orientation, a movement into different imaginaries and futurities that Peele's deliberate shifts in perspective literalizes. These different versions of the Black girl, amplified when we consider the ways that one of the film's pleasures is knowing that the actors are embodying doubles and that these characters may be in dialogue with what we know about their other roles and their own lives. So in other words, the repeated mirror scenes make apparent the ways that Black women and girls are bound by projections foisted upon Black femininity. But it also shows us the ways that their being cannot be captured by them. This excess, which I call noisy in its illegibility and uncanny in its disruption of an imagined ontological stability, is where we locate both the threat of Black women and the radical potential of Black girls. One both is and is not what one seems, which is one of the persistent threads of this talk. So while us allows us to use the uncanny to see how the Black girl, as a sort of cinematic screen or mirror, activates temporally complex forms of misrecognition, in invoking the specter of the Black girl within figurations of Black women and Black feminisms, which is one of the dimensions of thinking about Black age. And sort of in the book everybody should read Habiba Ibrahim's Black Age. It's really brilliant thinking about like how age complicates our visions of Black feminism and narratives around Blackness. So one of these dimensions of thinking about Black age, which sutures the Black girl with the Black woman, think about how these moments of the mirror remind viewers of the connection between the girl in the mirror, Addie, Adelaide, and Red. These are dynamics that activate different kinds of attachments and frictions, allowing me to connect this analysis with us with a meditation on how Black girls more generally puncture the work of theorizing, activating polytemporality in unexpected ways, thus broadening the me, or us, found in these Black girl mirrors. So while the bulk of my analysis of us unpacks the stakes of the uncanny as an effective sensorial and aesthetic schema that reveals layers to thinking about how Black women and girls circulate both within the film and more broadly, here my move is toward critical reflexivity. And that's sort of like part of the bigger project of the book, which is sort of thinking about where we are and how the particular sensations that these objects that we encounter, what they activate within us, and using that as part of a critical apparatus. So throughout In the Wake, Christina Sharp returns repeatedly to a photograph of a Haitian girl with the word ship written in tape on her forehead. Sharp is compelled by her face and the historical echoes that she produces, the uncanny again. The first resonance Sharp identifies is with Louis Agassiz's infamous daguerreotypes of the enslaved women Delia and Drena. In Sharp's recognition of the girl through the condition of being in the wake, which is to say in the temporal always of the injury of enslavement, we see how the transit of age between adult and girl, historical moment 1850, 2010, and place South Carolina and Haiti are mapped onto the figure of the Black girl. This quality is what creates continuity between the disparate aftermaths of enslavement, disenfranchisement, dispossession, objectification, and sexualization. Later, when Sharp returns to the girl, she puts her in conversation with yet other Black girls. And this is Sharp. And so this girl from the archives of the disaster of the first month of the second decade of the 21st century is evocative of another two girls on board that slave ship Recovery. Mm-hmm. And they are evocative of other contemporary girls as they too are misseen and all too often unaccounted for. The girls Sharp references aboard the Recovery are those that Saidiya Hartman documents in Venus in Two Acts. Although Sharp and Hartman transform these practices of looking at and looking for these Black girls into a type of mirror gaze, the fact that Us is a film, a moving picture, activates different coordinates vis-a-vis the Black girl and her noise, which is to say the kinetic. So specifically, I find kinetic strategies of bodily movement and extension in the film's deployment of whistling, which figures prominently. When young Addie enters the Hall of Mirrors, she is visibly unnerved and begins to whistle the Itsy Bitsy Spider. When she rounds the corner, she hears distorted whistling return to her, which sets the stage for the encounter between the girls. Later, just before Red enters the house, we hear her whistling the Itsy Bitsy Spider again. And finally, Red whistles the tune just before she is strangled by Adelaide. The whistling acts as a mark of identification and time travel. Connecting girl Adelaide to adult Red, it offers a sonic clue for audiences even before the final scene's confirmation of this twist. While voice offers more emotional nuance, it is also a more vulnerable instrument because the larynx requires using many interconnected muscles to operate. As we can hear in Red's strangled voice, which Nyong'o modeled on the speech patterns of people with spasmodic dysphonia, a condition in which muscles that control the larynx are rendered dysfunctional either because of trauma or lack of use, much can impede vocalization. Whistling, on the other hand, is the sound made when breath is exhaled through puckered lips. The tongue helps guide the air to produce different pitches, enabling a tune. Since it's not reliant on the maintenance of muscle tone, whistling more faithfully reproduces pitch than voice. Whistling offers the ability to produce messages that accurately span distance, acting as a specific kind of expansion of self, in which its fidelity to pitch heightens the intensity of connections. In this way, we can register young Addie's whistling for comfort as a way to link herself to the space of emotional security, which is kind of an imaginary landscape. On the other hand, the same whistled song brings Adelaide back to her girlhood and her insecurity, even as it brings dying comfort to Red. What we see is that the Black girl has reconfigured the landscape sonically so that it has contours that only she will understand. In whistling, then, I find an echo of Catherine McKittrick's argument about the illegibility of Black female geographies. And this is McKittrick: the dispossessed Black female body is often equated with the ungeographic, and Black women's spatial knowledges are rendered either inadequate or impossible. Right? So this is sort of like these remakings of place, I think, are part of this opacity. So perhaps because I'm the same age as Jordan Peele, which is like, I don't know, very fun for me. The sight of young Addie in 1986 speaks to me in particular ways. Her hair ties and pigtails feel familiar, and the Thriller t-shirt that her father wins at the boardwalk reminds me of watching the video for the first time with my uncle, brothers, and cousins in like the bright afternoon. I remember and don't quite remember the 80s, which means that Addie provides insight into some of the specifics of a girlhood that still resides in me somewhere. Perhaps I recognize her shock that the world is different than she expected. Still, she haunts in ways that Abraham, Sharp, and Hartman describe. Further, in this externalization of the Black girl who attaches to me but is not me, she is uncanny. I sense some of her resistance to transparency. I have access to her memories but not my own thinking or my own unruliness. Because of this uncanniness, it is easier to graft this noise onto others. Tra-la-la-la-la, something about a sugar plum. My mother's soft Caribbean lilt comes through the telephone. I have asked her if she knows the song Brown Girl in the Ring, and she responds by singing. When it was her turn in the middle of the circle, she said she would shake her hips. Wind up she waist, she says, and we giggle. When I think of a Black girl, it is my mother whose image pops into my head. I think of this skinny child with knobby knees, mischievous eyes, and a grin that is slightly too wide for her face, with her hair neatly plaited with ribbons. In the photographs I have seen, I always recognize her immediately. She is the one who always looks slightly off camera, as if she had better things to be doing. This girl is anchored deeply within my tenderness. I feel protective over her, though I already know who she has become. But it is these parts of her that I can't access, the uncanny, which interest me most. How are we different? What is she looking at? What fruit did she just eat? Her thoughts and visions are infinitely more mysterious than those of my own girlhood, which I maybe half remember, but which arrive already attached to emotions and circumstances with which I am familiar. This space of difference, even and especially in familiarity, is the other side of misrecognizing the Black girl. This is to think with Christina Sharp's question upon encountering the photograph, what is the look in her eyes, without seeking the recognizable. It is also to remember that this unruliness means that something actual, interior, is always missed. To find this, Sharp performs her own strategy of alternate sight, annotation. I saw that leaf in her hair, and with it I performed my own annotation that might open this image out into a life, however precarious, that was always there. That leaf is stuck in her hair, in her still neat braids, and I think somebody braided her hair before that earthquake hit. As figuration, the Black girl exists in the space between representation and misrecognition. Locating her requires creative reading practices. My mother is the Black girl, is the girl I recognize but also do not. Some of this oscillation has to do with diaspora and the tension between desire for belonging and the differences produced by time and geography, among other things. In teasing out the vicissitudes of diaspora, Nadia Ellis emphasizes this quality of difference, naming it the space-time of elsewhere. In my account, that Black diaspora is characterized by a distinctive desire to belong elsewhere, which desire produces a productive tension between attachment and a drive toward intense and idiosyncratic individuation. My mother was a girl in St. Vincent, a place I only know as a visitor. And so while I can register some embodied similarities between me and my mother, it is a sense of belonging to a place that I can't fully understand. It is also much easier for me to flatten out these contours into a simplistic form of attachment than to grapple with her migration and the aftermath of histories lived here and there, diaspora producing its own version of the uncanny, the unheimlich. I concluded Sensual Excess with the question, is the mother a place? In order to situate orientations toward indivisibility, care, and femininity within a non-Oedipal psychoanalytic framework. By foregrounding my relationship to the Caribbean as both real and imagined place, I am showing my own specific negotiations with the maternal as place, both as ground for my investigation and as a site of expansion beyond discipline, including Oedipality. This sense Caribbean might not tell us much about the actualities of Caribbean life, but it gives an example of how places and temporalities live in people. So in this girl, I am looking for belonging, but when I look in her eyes, I see things I cannot place, uncanniness again. A disconnect compounded when she tells me stories about finding and tampering with Jack Spaniard wasp nests on lazy afternoons. But why? Did you get stung? Yes, I think I wanted attention. She shrugs over the phone. She will laugh and say that she used to get stung so much and it was painful and that they would often go for her face. Once she was stung so extensively and the swelling so bad, her mother was forced to cancel a family outing because she couldn't see. I did some research on these wasps and saw that they build paper nests near water, but in the shade, and I knew immediately which gutters they would be near. Some on roofs and some to help the rainwater ease its way down hillsides, places where I hid from cousins during games. And so it's in this act of remaking site and place with wasps, an act that on its face is indecipherable to me, that I find the possibilities and noise in the uncanniness of the Black girl. Thank you. I feel like we went on a journey.
Yes, I know. Yeah, thank you so much for that. It was so rich. And I don't want to take up too much time because there's so many, there's such a big audience and I want to open it up. But I was thinking about just the way that you end, right? Bringing it back to your mom and what memories are evoked in our own bodies. And I'm thinking also about the introduction of the book where you have this extended section where you situate yourself within these very complex histories. And I really appreciate the way that, there's all this critique and theory, but it's always situated within the body in your experience as well. So I'd love to hear more about that choice to place yourself as the spectator and as, someone who is having an embodied experience watching this film.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it sort of came from the fact that with this project, I really wanted to complicate how we were thinking about embodiment. Because I feel like it's very easy to sort of be like, this is a body, this is how we are like, everybody's body is different. But actually, everybody's sense of what constitutes a body and sort of like these different systems of knowledge are all different. I also was like very into acupuncture, so Chinese traditional medicine and yoga. So they all have different versions of like what a body is. And so I really wanted to try to imagine like what it would be to use those frameworks as a critical apparatus. But I found that there was no way to do that because they're all sensational without putting my own body like really explicitly into the framework. Because part of what I was really making was an argument for the importance of specificity. And so I felt like in all my other work, I'd been kind of like withholding. I was like, a lot of people think this. And then here I finally had to be like, okay, I think this. This is my me. Yeah. And so it sort of came from that, but also because a lot of the specific frameworks that I was really interested in were just like so particular. I knew they were so particular to like my experience. I was like, I mean, who knows? Maybe other people watching Jordan Peele are like, my mom, but probably not. So I was really interested in thinking about like, it took a lot of work then to kind of distill like what was being activated and think about like what was important about what was being activated, because obviously at any moment many things are going on in the body, some of which could lead to like critical investigation and some of which more like I think I need to eat or like like it's not every signal is deeply important for in like a permanent way.
So I'm also thinking of this approach as an invitation, right, to the reader in a way where, how do you embody the theory so that we're engaging with the text or whatever the text is or whatever, artifact we're engaging with, to really think about how am I coming to this, right? And so it's not just knowledge or the creation of knowledge outside of ourselves, but seeing that knowledge is being triggered within us.
Yes. No, that's exactly, I mean, so in some ways this is sort of a weird book because it's really, it's like a pitch for a method and in an orientation. Yeah. So there are specific, I mean, obviously I just gave you guys a specific argument. Like there are arguments within it, but it's more an argument, as you say, for sort of like paying attention to where you are and what knowledge you already have. Yeah. Because that was what was, I think, most exciting to me, that it's kind of, or I wanted to destabilize the idea that mastery comes in like one particular form, and to really think about like all of these modes of knowledge that we have that are perhaps passed down from like our families or just from other types of situations that we've been in, but that we already have it. Yeah. And so trying to like invite people to access that.
Yeah, and I think also, in that image of your mom and thinking about her relationship to the Caribbean and then wondering, knowing that that exists inside you in some way, but how do you access that and the uncanny relationship with that history?
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, so in addition to this nested set of arguments about like embodied knowledge, I also did want to, I talk about this concept called the body place, and it's kind of thinking broadly about like all of the different geographies and temporalities that are with us all the time. So it's like St. Vincent is in me because of my history. Like even though I'm in LA right now, it is still here. So we're sort of always this like unruly mass of times and people and things, and sort of I wanted to try to think about like how to activate that or honor that in some way, and sort of not just have it be like, I have seen this thing and it's only about, like this direct line. Because I feel like there was a way in which I could have just ended the us talk with being like, and black girls are unruly. But it felt important to sort of be like another part of this dimension, or a part of my interest in these multiple modes of the uncanny is because of what I am bringing forward. So in some ways it's also an argument for thinking very broadly about what attachment can be, like in terms of geographies and people and times. And
then attachment takes us back to us.
Yeah.
So I'd love to open up and see if there's any questions.
Hi, I really loved your talk. I have so many questions, but I'm going to try and pick one I think is the most interesting or most impactful. So I was wondering if you had particular thoughts about the way that Jordan Peele reworks Black culture as a signifier of horror, even like the tagline of the movie being "Watch Yourself," or also I think it's this trailer where it has like the slowed down version of "I Got Five" on it, and how it's kind of become like also part of like this brand kind of. And I even noticed that like I've seen online sometimes Black people will like hear a song and be like, "Oh, Jordan Peele should like horrify this" or something. Like there's this idea like there's something there. And so I was curious if you had thoughts about just the way that he like activates Black culture as a signifier of horror, especially like kind of distance from the Black body as a signifier of horror.
No, that's such a great question. I feel like I'm still figuring out how to talk broadly, because with every film, I feel like my understanding of what his project is shifts. So, I mean, Get Out, in some ways, I was like, okay, well, this feels very legible. What is happening? And then Us, I was like, I really was not prepared for this. And I'm still actually a little bit ambivalent in some way. Like, I think there's a lot to talk about with the film, but I'm not totally sure I think there might be a little bit something dangerous about some of Peele's politics in the film, because the primary antagonism is like between two Black women, and it's sort of, no one really wins, and like I feel like that is very, and I definitely understand that it's not like all films have to have positive or negative representation, but it does make it complicated. And then with Nope, that also just sort of went off the rails. But Nope made me think that, I saw it on a plane and I need to like re-see it to talk about it in a real way, because but Nope has made me think that Peele's primary project is actually around questions of representation, where I think in some ways like Black culture is part of it. And I think because of Get Out, people are most attached to that version, but I don't think it's all, like I really do think he's really interested in like the apparatus of cinema itself, and like what are the different types of power relations that are embedded in like the industry, but also just like what does it mean to be captured on film. So I think it's weird, because I think if Nope had been I don't know what would have happened if Nope had been the first one, but like if it had been, I think we'd have different questions around what Peele is doing with Black culture. So I don't think Blackness is as central to his project, but I do think because he's working in the horror genre, he really shows the ways that Blackness's ontological instability really complicates any modes of reading what those genres are doing in a way that is like really amazing and clever, and I think does offer possibility for different forms of critique. Hi, nice to see you.
So I have a question. Well, it's not really, it's more like a comment than a question.
Could you project more?
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, it's still forming in my mind, but what you were saying about the Caribbean is really productive for me. And I'm not yet sure what to do with this, but you're making me think about both Lupita and Winston. Lupita, who is Afro-Mexican, I think, Afro-Latina, and Winston, who is from Tobago, and I'm trying to think about what it means for them to be playing Black American characters, because I think there's something there as well in terms of embodiment. And so I don't know if you have anything, have any thoughts about that as well.
I wish I did, but because I think it's very interesting. I've gotten, I actually did not know that about Winston, but I've gotten that question around Lupita's Mexican, because then it's led people to read her characters line about we should go to Mexico as kind of like more of a homecoming than a, but I was like, I'm not ceding the settler colonial logic of her character, so like I'm not gonna go there. But I do think it really, I agree with you that I think it like, if Peele is doing, I do think there is a, like, we have to take seriously like what he's doing with US empire. And I do think I think you're absolutely, I think one could do more with the casting and like how that destabilizes like who these characters are supposed to be. But there is also this longer history of kind of who is, which Black people have been able to ascend, and it has, at least historically, like a lot of more migrants from the Caribbean are more part of like the Black middle class. So there's also, even though those characters in the film, I don't think we're given to understand them in that kind of formation, but you could kind of wonder if there's some sort of thing with that. But we can also, I think about like the way that that's producing and its own other form of uncanniness, and its own sort of other doubles within the doubles. Like I think in general, just like, I don't quite know how to think about it, but this movie also feels like it's also saying something about acting and like the process of acting, because not only because you're seeing them act so much in these multiple roles, but it just feels like there's something there that you are supposed to import this information about them, so that it's more like triples or quadruples than doubles. So, thank you.
There was a question, yeah.
I wanted to ask about.
Could you be just, I'm sorry, since we don't have individual mics, could you project more, please?
Yeah, I love your talk. I was wondering maybe about the relationship between like edible or edibalization and the uncanny and the like Black interview relations, so beyond the film, in the film and beyond. Like I'm thinking about like David Marriott talking about like the Black is no Oedipus, right? And like the ontological consequences of that being that the Black is like caught in this moment of uncanny abeyance, or what he calls like traumatic relatedness, right? And then also somehow moving to Rest, right? Thinking about how the Black man and the woman have no real others for each other. And so what kind of consequences that have for the formation of the unconscious and also the formation of like intramural relations as such. Yeah, and also like thinking about child killing too, like the Black woman has no representation because she's subsumed into the Black, right? So I was wondering if you have thought along those currents and what that means for like your notion of uncanniness within the film.
No, those are great questions. I mean, I think in a lot of ways, though my reading of the film doesn't delve into those particular currents, I don't think it disturbs them. Like, I think it can sit very alongside. I mean, one of the things with all of the mirrors, in some ways it's all, and being a film kind of about acting, it is so much about the surface. So it's just like this persistent unknowability of these characters is something that I would definitely put alongside kind of the impossible, or Marriott's argument about the impossibility of an unconscious. I think it's sort of, I don't know that I specifically agree with Marriott, but I think there is something to kind of the surfacing of this inscrutability, right? And sort of like, and so for me, that's how I'm reading what the uncanny is doing. It's that it's making us very aware that we have no idea what these characters are like actually thinking. Like Peele produces, I mean, that's also what's interesting about the Black girl in the mirror. So it's like, we think we know that this is the motivation for these characters and therefore some of their interiority, but it's actually like a flashback. It's not actually that's not really what's happening. Like, we don't really know, which just sort of further amplifies like what, you know, that we have no idea. And then just sort of the perpetual, I mean, I guess I would read Keeling's argument more in terms of like the repetition of images as part of what produces like like there's just so much ontological instability here, right? So we have it's unclear what kind of psychological depth we're working with, and it's also unclear what kind of like representational stability, because we have like these possible 4 people, we have 2 people, you know, we have all of these different kinds of things going on. So I think in that way, like one could argue that Peele is very much in line with these ideas. I mean, I think it's complicated because I don't know that he's making like I don't know what the upshot of that then is, because it's sort of like, okay, we have threat. And so for me, that's what I'm interested in, the uncanny as a mobilized sensation, more than necessarily like a particular psychological term. Although I do think it is really interesting that Freud's version of the uncanny is so connected to home, which is so destabilized by the category of blackness in multiple types of ways. So that allows us to think about this, this affect in a different kind of way. But I think it's, yeah, but I was more sort of like, what can we do if we're thinking with, less with the psychology of the uncanny and more with the like, you're feeling something and then what do we do with that? But that's a great question. Yeah.
I think we have time for maybe one more.
Hi, I'm Venus. I loved your talk, it was really fab. I was really curious about your discussion of Nadia Ellis's Space-Time Elsewhere. And I was thinking about Get Out because of how Peele sort of visualizes the sunken place. And I wondered if you thought about the connection there. And also, I think I'm really fascinated by like your method of sensation and embodiment overall. And I was also curious if you were thinking about Peele's choice to work with darker skinned actors and the sort of role of colorism, and thinking about cinema too and how it's capturing the light and the shadows, skin colors.
Yeah, those are good questions. I had not made a connection between Nadia Ellis's Elsewhere and the sunken. I think partially because it's like the affect of the sunken place is so like horrifying, you know. And when I'm thinking about Ellis's argument, it is true that it is more ambivalent than just like a joyful diasporic connection. Like there's more friction there. Yeah, so I'm not sure. I don't know. I don't have any better response to that. But it is making me real. You know, one of the things about that's emerging is that Peele is a very psychologically. It feels like he's reading Freud, because I'd always connected the sunken place more to thinking about the superego, and thinking about like that as enacting kind of like the battle between like superego and I guess not exactly id, but like id as the moment when like something erupts and they kind of like start crying or something. Like it's like that which can't really be repressed at that point anymore. So yeah, which and in that way I don't read Ellis's Elsewhere as I read it as more sensational than psychological, which is not to say that sensations don't have psychologies, but I think there is something to staying with like the surface and not trying to imagine we understand like what transparent dynamics might be at play. So I think that that's kind of part of what my stake is in thinking about sensation as a method. It's in a lot of ways it's like to allow all these different subject positions to have their own psychologies without me having to be like, oh, this is why they're doing this is that, this is that. But to acknowledge that there is thinking, but that I'm interested in kind of, it's a perceptual thing, and this sort of goes back to the question of the uncanny. So it's like they're thinking, but the thing I have access to is how it makes me feel. And so working from that rather than to try to unpack or sort of assign whatever, because that can be so, those processes of projection can be so dangerous. And so it's kind of, so that's part of why I'm interested in sensation, because it just feels like a more solid thing to have access to, that can still open up lots of critical spaces, but not, I am imagining it as like less colonizing, honestly, than it would, because you're not saying, I'm not saying like Lupita felt this, I'm sort of saying, when I see Lupita do that, I feel this. But I don't know what to say about I do know that Peele works with specific cinematographers who are like very good at capturing darker skin but I don't know, I don't have a good, but it is really interesting to think about like what this sort of goes back to like, I'm not totally clear what I think his broader racial project is. And sometimes he makes choices that I'm like very excited about, and sometimes he doesn't. And yeah, that's a good question.
Thank you all so much for coming. And thank you.